On a late summer day, in the town of Olympia, South Carolina, a strange occurrence was unfolding down near the river. Olympia, a relatively large city of 100,000 people, is split in half by the Congaree River. The Congaree is the result of two different rivers, the Saluda and Broad Rivers, which meet at the junction where Olympia was founded. A man was going down to the Congaree River, to a secluded little stretch of land hidden away from the main roads. He parked in a gravel parking lot, which he really had to know existed before going there. Just a short distance away, shrouded by a small patch of woods that thrived alongside the river, was a boat ramp that plunged into the Congaree. Jack was 65 years old, a military vet who had spent time in Vietnam. He was, by all accounts, a pretty regular guy. He was unmarried, with only a single child from his lone marriage, and now 2 young grandchildren. And other than some volunteer work he did, he primarily kept to himself. On Saturday, August 17th, 1996, the temperature in Olympia was in the low 90s, which isn't unusual for that time of year. The sun would not set until roughly 8 p.m., and it wouldn't be truly dark until 8:30 or 9. At the time Jack Robinson arrived at this parking lot, approximately 6 p.m., it would still be daylight. Yet, despite the sun still shining, despite the handful of witnesses that saw Jack arrive at the parking lot, police have yet to figure out what this man was doing at the boat landing. Jack did not sail, nor did he own a boat. None of his records indicated that he was meeting someone at this lot, but that's what witnesses recall. Jack meeting a man, speaking for a few minutes, before the conversation turned violent and then fatal. This is the story of Jack L. Robinson. Welcome to Unresolved. I'm your host, Michael Whelan, and this episode will focus on the mysterious death of Jack L. Robinson. Throughout the episode, you'll occasionally hear from Tammy, Jack's only child and one of his few surviving family members. It was from her that I learned about this terrifying and tragic story, which unfolded in Olympia, South Carolina in the mid-1990s. If you would like to support the podcast, you could do so by leaving a review on iTunes or Apple Podcast. A 5-star rating and a good review do go a long way. But if you would like to become a patron and help make the podcast a regular weekly show, you could do so by heading to patreon.com/unresolvedpod. If you would like to learn more about the podcast, or how to support it, please listen through to the end of the episode. But now, without any further ado, let's roll back the clock and learn a little bit about the subject of today's episode. That is, of course, Jack Robinson himself. Jack Robinson was born on July 24th, 1931, in Olympia, South Carolina. At the time, Olympia was in the middle of a huge economic surge, becoming a major business hub in the Carolina, Georgia area. Little is known about Jack's parents, Joel Littleton and Ethel Mae Bradley Robinson. However, we do know that Jack was not alone in his development. He had at least one brother, named Odell, and 3 sisters, named Connie, May, and Myrtle. All of his siblings are now deceased, save for one, a sister who is now closing in on 90 years old. Jack and his family lived in the Olympia neighborhood of Olympia, an area that cropped up in the early 1900s around the Olympia textile mill. He attended Olympia High School in the time period following World War II, and growing up in that time period seems to have inspired him to follow a certain career path, that of a United States Airman. Shortly after graduating from high school, Jack enlisted in the U.S. Air Force. He was sent off to basic training, and his first post took him to the furthest corner of the United States, Fairbanks, Alaska. Jack would go on to spend 25 years in the Air Force, rising to the rank of Technical Sergeant, which is no easy feat as an enlisted airman. During his time in the military, he had a child, a daughter named Tammy. She would be his only child, but the two would remain close throughout the rest of Jack's life. After retiring from the military, Jack returned to the area that he had been born in, Olympia, South Carolina. This is where Tammy would grow up, a town steeped in history, divided by the Congaree River. a river that would go on to play a vital role in this story later on. After retiring from the military, Jack Robinson entered civil service, getting a job at the nearby Moncrief Army Health Clinic at Columbia's Fort Jackson. I can't really tell you what he did in this job, but various news articles have referred to him as a, quote, laboratory employee. This could point to any number of positions within an army hospital, but he had close relationships with the many doctors, nurses, and technicians that he worked with. Jack worked at the Moncrief Hospital for 20 years, and he would go on to retire from there as well. At this point, you'd imagine that Jack, in his early to mid-60s, would be living the easy life. He now had 2 pensions, a small family consisting of his siblings, his daughter, and now 2 grandsons, and all of the time in the world. However, according to reports, Jack did not simply use this time to rest on his laurels. Jack had been slightly involved in politics throughout his life, but he spent some of this time off to volunteer and work more closely with his local Democratic Party. And other than that, he was noted for constantly volunteering at homeless shelters and soup kitchens. Many point to this being where he would meet his eventual killer, but Jack was constantly keeping busy and trying to accomplish some good in the world with his spare time. Going into 1996, Jack had accomplished a life's worth of achievements before the typical age of retirement. He had spent over 45 years as a civil servant, including a stint in Vietnam, and was now looking forward to the next chapter of his life. He lived in the Wellesley Place Apartments in the northeastern reaches of Columbia named Sandwood. It wasn't the best apartment that money could buy, but it was comfortable enough for Jack. He had a small number of friends, but by all accounts was an incredibly quiet guy who kept to himself in his apartment at 3630 Ranch Road. Jack had always had a good relationship with his daughter, Tammy, and her 2 sons, Doug and Matthew. Tammy was now a woman grown, and had introduced her 2 children to the world in the mid-1980s. Both of Jack's grandsons have fond memories of the man, even though they didn't get to see him much in the weeks before his eventual death. On July 24th, 1996, Jack celebrated his 65th birthday. At the time, neither he, nor his friends or family, were aware that it would be his last. On August 17th, 1996, Jack drove from his apartment in Wellesley Place to the middle of Columbia, roughly a 10-mile trip. There's no indication that he was meeting up with anyone, or knew who he was going to be speaking to. Jack parked nearby the Rosewood Boat Landing, which has since been renamed the Jordan Memorial Boat Ramp. If you look up the area online, you'll notice that even now, over 20 years later, the boat ramp is a little out of the way. It's connected to the city center, but you have to take some back roads to get to this landing. The boat landing itself is just a ramp that descends into the waiting Congaree River, and the area, which is a little more than some pavement and gravel, is surrounded by a ringed batch of woods.
The place that he was at, I mean, when I went down there, they've changed it a lot. It's grown up a lot. I couldn't even get to the area where it actually took place because it had grown up so much. There used to be like a walkway that went around because it's right on the Congaree River there, but I never even knew the place was back there. There's a rock quarry back there. There's now, it used to be nothing but woods, but now, and just the rock quarry, but now they've opened it up and there's all kinds of warehouses and all kinds of buildings and stuff, but as many years as I lived there, I knew the rock quarry was there, but I had no idea that there was a boat ramp there and picnic tables and stuff like that for people to go for as long as I lived there. And why my dad was down there, I have no clue. I have no clue whatsoever, so it's beyond me.
It's likely that Jack was heading to this spot for a reason, but that reason has never been clarified because of the events that would follow his arrival. It was around 6 p.m. when Jack arrived, but perhaps just slightly before. It was still bright out, as the sun does not set in Carolina until at least 8 o'clock throughout the summer months. There were 3 witnesses that saw Jack arrive and meet up with another man. The other man was younger, with darker skin and sunglasses. The 2 men seemed to know one another, or at least that's how it appeared to anyone watching. These 3 witnesses were parked in the same parking lot, and they were waiting for a concert nearby to get started. Sitting there and waiting, they saw Jack and this other man meet up in the parking lot and head to a grass clearing in the surrounding woods. The 2 men got out of their sight, but before long, an argument broke out between them. The 3 witnesses only heard bits and pieces of their argument, primarily what Jack was saying. Jack was making claims about money, saying that he could get money for the other man. One of the witnesses heard Jack loudly exclaim, quote, "What is it that you want?" before the argument seems to have gotten physical. The other man who had been arguing with Jack ran off on foot, and Jack came walking out of the wooded area clutching his stomach. He was bleeding from multiple wounds, and pleading for help. The witnesses called an ambulance for Jack, and he was rushed to the nearby Palmetto Health Richland Hospital. By that point, his wounds had already grown too severe. Within 3 hours, Jack L. Robinson had passed away. The autopsy showed that Jack had suffered at least 3 wounds to his stomach, and had been cut once on the side of his face. Jack also had defensive cuts to his hands, implying that he did not go quietly. The ultimate cause of death was a perforated liver due to the stab wounds to his gut, but Jack had also lost an extreme amount of blood on his way to the hospital. The 3 eyewitnesses, who had been there to help get Jack emergency treatment, gave their statements to police. They all described what they had seen, both Jack and this mysterious suspect showing up at the Rosewood Boat Landing and walking off into the woods. Based on their statements, it's unclear whether the 2 men met up at the landing or just so happened to be walking close together, but by all indications, the conversation between the 2 was as acquaintances or even friends. The witnesses, and now police, believe that Jack and this mysterious person of interest knew each other. The witnesses gave a solid description of this man to police, and they made a sketch of this suspect, which you could still find online. This man was olive-skinned, likely Hispanic, and he was between the ages of 25 and 35. He was not that big, standing approximately 5 feet 5 inches tall, and weighing somewhere between 150 and 180 pounds. He had black hair and a light mustache, and he was wearing aviator sunglasses, so the witnesses could not get a good look at those obscured features. As police began to work with that description, the family prepared for mourning. Jack L. Robinson was memorialized at the Southern Baptist Church on Thursday, August 22nd, less than a week after his death. The ceremony was presided over by Pastor Charlie Arnold, and Jack's grandsons, Doug and Matthew, stood as pallbearers for their grandfather. Jack was then buried at Greenlawn Memorial Park, where he rests today. He was given full military rights before being laid to rest. His daughter, Tammy, despite now living in Florida, returns regularly to his grave to pay her respects. The police began to investigate the cause and meaning of Jack Robinson's death, which ultimately boiled down to a single question. What was he doing at the boat landing on that particular Saturday? You see, Jack did not own a boat, nor was he known to sail. So then you ask yourself, why else would Jack show up at a boat landing at 6 p.m. on a Saturday evening? Drugs? Alcohol? According to all records, Jack did not indulge in either. He had no known history of drinking or using any drugs, so that was another trail that led nowhere. Police scoured through Jack's phone records and bank statements, hoping to come across something that would lead them in the right direction. But according to both, Jack was a relatively mundane individual. Nothing in his records stood out to them. As I said earlier, he mostly kept to himself, other than visiting family and volunteering. From his phone records, police were able to definitively state that he did not make plans to go out that evening, at least not via telephone. So this led them to the very real possibility that the man who had killed Jack whom he had spoken to as a friend or acquaintance at the Rosewood Boat Landing, had run into him on a chance encounter. However, when Jack's daughter Tammy spoke to police shortly after his murder, she was told something incredibly surprising. One of the theories police were circulating was that the man who had killed Jack was his gay lover. If you listen to Tammy talk about this, you could hear the skepticism in her voice.
When my uncle had called me and said, Tammy, this is what's happened. We need you to get here to Columbia because you need to identify your dad's body, and we've got to talk to the sheriff, to the cops and the detectives. And when we got there that day, when we finally got there, and after I, saw my dad's body and had to identify him, which was a very tough thing, we sat around that table, and the first thing that came out of the detective's mouth was, well, of course, why we're here. Your father, Mr. Robinson, was murdered. But we also want to let you know that he was murdered by his gay lover. Well, first of all, I would have never in my years of my whole entire life would I have ever suspected my father was gay. And it was like almost simultaneously at the same time, all of us said, well, you're talking about the wrong person, including his brothers and his sisters. And they said, no, this is Mr. Robinson. And they showed us his picture, and we're like, yes, that's him. But you're not talking about him as far as, in that reference. And so that is what they were going on. And since then, yes, it's very hard for me to understand that. Of course, I'm older now, and yes, it's now 20 years. And, well, I guess it's possible. People, he was military, he was retired Air Force, he was retired civil service out at Fort Jackson, and we traveled around. I was an Air Force brat, and back in those days, if people you got married, you kept your mouth shut, you didn't let nobody know about it, and, you had a hush-hush life, I guess. And is it possible? I guess it is. Do I believe it? It's very hard for me to believe. But if it turned out to be that way, he was my dad. I love him to death. I miss him. He's missed out on the life of his two grandsons, and now he's got two great grandsons.
To me, this doesn't sound like the most outlandish theory, but it's still a little bit out there. Jack, having been born in the 1930s and spending over 25 years in the military, would likely have some outdated thoughts on being gay. It's possible, if he was engaging in that kind of activity, that he would want to keep it quiet. He likely would not tell his family or his friend circle at the least. It's possible that throughout his life, this was an issue he internally struggled with. However, there has been little to no evidence of this being a fact. Police created this theory after tracking down some of Jack's movements in his final weeks and months, and noted that some of the places he went as being noteworthy for this theory. I don't have all the details on that, so I'll continue to throw out that this is nothing more than a theory. Likely a theory that has since been abandoned. Police eventually brought out bloodhounds to the location of Jack's murder, the Rosewood Boat Landing, which is right in the heart of the Olympia neighborhood of Columbia. As I said earlier, this boat landing is hidden away on the east side of the Congaree River, but police were hoping that the dogs would be able to pick up a scent or something. The bloodhounds led police from the spot of Jack's murder to a nearby business. This business, which has remained unidentified in official reports, would pop up in the news a little over a year later. That is when another murder took place in Columbia, South Carolina. Kimberly Brown, a 30-year-old woman living in the northern outskirts of Columbia, worked at the same Moncrief Army Health Clinic as Jack Robinson. In fact, she had worked alongside Jack for over 5 years as a blood technician at the military hospital. Kimberly did not have any children of her own, but she was the guardian for her niece, 3-year-old Leah Brazil. In some news reports, Leah is reported as being Kim's daughter, but Kim was simply taking care of the girl for the foreseeable future, due to some issues with Leah's estranged parents. On Tuesday, November 18th, 1997, Kimberly failed to show up to work. This immediately surprised her coworkers, who noted her absence because she had never failed to show up before. Kimberly's mother, Cora, had tried calling Kimberly a handful of times. When her daughter failed to answer the phone, Cora became incredibly concerned. On Tuesday, she went over to Kim's apartment in the morning and was surprised to find the front door to the apartment unlocked. Letting herself in, she was shocked to find both Kimberly and Leah missing, but what looked like blood on the carpet. Cora contacted the Moncrief Army Hospital, who informed her that Kim had not shown up to work, and then Cora immediately contacted the Richland County Sheriff's Department. Police began scouring through Kim's apartment, looking for any clues. They quickly found Kim's address book and began reaching out to individuals that stood out. One person of interest quickly emerged. His name was Max Noten, a young family friend of Kimberly's. Max Noten was 20 years old at this point in 1997, and he had grown up pretty close to Kimberly's family. You see, their fathers had joined the army together, using the buddy system. This led to both families going to the same duty stations and growing up alongside one another. Max was best friends with Kim's younger brother, and that's how the two continued to know one another. When police reached out to the contacts in Kim's address book, Max admitted to seeing Kimberly in the time period of 9 and 10 p.m. on Monday evening. When all was said and done, this became the last known sighting of the woman, making Max the main person of interest in the disappearance. Police asked Max if he would mind coming into the station to answer some questions, and he agreed. He gave the police a pretty detailed statement regarding his visit to Kimberly's apartment on Monday evening, but then stated that he left around 10 p.m. and spent the night at a co-worker's home. When police reached out to this co-worker, they validated Max's alibi. However, later on, this co-worker would rectify the statement by telling police that he had been asked to do so by Max Noten, that Max had not spent the night at their house, and that they had been asked to lie to police. Any suspicion that police had had of Max would be amplified 100-fold after this admission, so they continued to follow through with him as the primary suspect. Police questioned Max again on Wednesday evening, and this is when his story began to fall apart. When questioned, he made a statement to the effect of visiting Kimberly's apartment on Monday, leaving, blacking out for the period of a few hours, and then waking up at the Rosewood Boat Landing. The boat landing, if you remember, is nearby where Jack Robinson was killed over a year beforehand. Over the next 24 hours, Max gave increasingly sketchy statements to interrogators. After admitting to having consensual sex with Kimberly in his third confession, police were certain that something terrible had happened to the young woman, as well as the niece she was the guardian of. The body of Kimberly Brown was found by fishermen in the Congaree River on Wednesday evening. It would take a few hours to identify her and locate the cause of death, but by the time police had both squared away, Max Noten had already confessed to the crime and told them the full story. He had gone over to Kim's apartment on Monday evening, where he had attacked Kimberly Brown, hitting her on the head with a sharp object, before raping and strangling her. He wrapped Kimberly up in a blanket, putting her in his trunk, then leaving at the break of dawn. He took Kim's 3-year-old niece, Leah, with him, telling her that they were going to go find her aunt. The little girl was still wearing her pajamas that morning when Max Noten pulled into the Rosewood Boat Landing parking lot, just off of Highway 601. The body of Kimberly Brown was found on Wednesday, nude but still wrapped up in that blanket. She had been sexually assaulted before her death, giving police a clear motive for the crime. The body of 3-year-old Leah Brazil, however, was not found until Thursday morning. She was still wearing the pajamas from Monday evening, and police would identify her cause of death as drowning. Police searched the trunk of Max Noten and discovered blood smears that were consistent with Kimberly Brown. He would face trial in 2001, eventually being convicted on 2 counts of murder and kidnapping, with an additional charge of sexual assault. He was given 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, as well as an additional 30 years for the sexual assault. So, you may be wondering why, in an episode dedicated to the murder of Jack Robinson, I told you about the murders of Kimberly Brown and Leah Brazil. Well, while it does seem like an odd choice of a sidebar, that case would go on to directly affect the investigation into Jack Robinson's killer. As always, my goal is to understand why a case or a story remains unresolved, and this is actually a major factor. After the murders of Kimberly Brown and Leah Brazil, police began to piece together the case, and several aspects of that case happened to match up with Jack Robinson. After all, Kim and Jack did know one another, having worked together for half a decade. Then, you have the fact that Jack was murdered and Kim's body was dumped at, what all records indicate, the very same boat ramp. And, not for nothing, do you remember the bloodhounds I told you about a few minutes ago? The dogs that were brought in after Jack's murder to pick up a scent? Those dogs led police straight from the spot Jack was murdered to a nearby business. Max Noten happened to work at that business. So, police were pretty certain that the case against Max Noten for Jack Robinson's murder would come together pretty easily. They essentially told this to Tammy, Jack's daughter, assuring her that throughout the trial of Max in the early 2000s, that they would learn more and put together a case against him. However, if you are a longtime listener of this podcast, you know that nothing is as easy as it seems.
Well, when all of this took place with Max, it was like instantly, Max is now the killer, and now the case is solved. That quick. It was like there was not a whole lot of detective work, nothing. It was like the minute Max walked in, he did it, and that was the end. And I even questioned the fact, well, if you don't have no DNA, if you don't have no knife, if you don't have any information, how can you just say, oh, well, Max did it, he's it, he's the one, just because he may have asked a question or did something.
When one truly examines the case against Max Noten for the murder of Jack Robinson, the faults are pretty self-evident. First of all, there's a difference in the physical characteristics of the crime. The suspect in Jack Robinson's case was described as a Hispanic man, roughly 5'5" and somewhere between 150 and 180 pounds. He also had dark hair and a mustache, and was described as being in the age range of 25 to 35 years old. Max Noten, on the other hand, is a black man who stands an inch or so above 6 feet, and weighed approximately 200 pounds at the time of his arrest. He did have dark hair, but showed no signs of a mustache, and he was only 20 years old at the time of his arrest in late 1997. That would make him 18 or 19 at the time of Jack Robinson's murder. Then you have to take the motives into account. Max Noten attacked Kimberly Brown because he was going to sexually assault her. There's no proof that the crime against Jack Robinson was comparable. In fact, it seems like he was killed over a money dispute. This also doesn't mention that their causes of death are extremely different. Jack was stabbed, whereas Kimberly was strangled and Leah was drowned. Lastly, you have the information that Jack was killed at the Rosewood Boat Landing, and then left. Meanwhile, Kimberly was killed beforehand and then dumped there, along with her niece. When you look at the facts, they just don't match up. Other than a coincidence or two, the crimes are just not compatible with one another. However, we do know that police investigated Max Noten for the death of Jack Robinson for those early years in the investigation, where information was much easier to come by than it is now. We can see that they did not do so deliberately, in an effort to curtail the investigation. They did it because Max was the only suspect that they could muster up, based on the evidence that they had. They would get some new evidence in the time period after Max Noten became a person of interest, when investigators discovered a rusty knife nearby the scene of Jack Robinson's murder. The knife, which appeared to have been there for some time, was a large hunting knife that had become rusty after exposure to the elements. It was found just a short distance away from where Jack Robinson had been stabbed, leading police to believe that it might have been the murder weapon. They hoped to test the knife for DNA, but because it had been outdoors for a long period of time, any test would be too inconclusive. Police were unable to verify whether it was the murder weapon, but articles published as recently as the past year indicate that they're still hopeful. Investigators hope that advances in DNA technology will allow them to test the knife more conclusively in the near future. Over the years, Jack's only child, Tammy, believed that the case of her father's murder was technically solved. Police had told her that Max was their one and only suspect, and that even though they didn't have enough evidence against him at the time, they believed him to be the killer.
About 3 years later, and up to this point, as far as I knew, Max Noten was charged of my father's murder, and if and when he ever got out of prison, then they would continue on with his murder, if he ever got out. So years went by, and as far as I knew, the last time I spoke to the detectives, they told me, Tammy, there's absolutely nothing we can do. Max has to either break out of prison or something has to happen to where he gets out of prison. There is nothing else that we can do at this time. So I went on with that belief. About 6 years ago, I had gone online because I have a lot of cousins with the name Jack, and I was trying to find and get in touch with a couple of my relatives that had moved away and whatever. And when I did, Richland County Sheriff's Office came up, cold case, unsolved murders. And when it did, Jack L. Robinson comes up, and there's his picture, and I click on it, and it takes me to Richland County Sheriff's Office cold case page. No suspects had been found. Jack L. Robinson murdered August 17th, 1996 at the Rosewood Boat Landing. Composite has been drawn by 3 witnesses. Suspect unknown. Well, needless to say, it about took me right back to the day that it happened. Because all these years, I thought that Max was the person, and nobody contacted me.
She got in touch with the investigators and discovered that they had dropped all assumptions about Max Noten years beforehand. They had, regretfully, never contacted Tammy to inform her of this development. Tammy looks back at this as one of the major mistakes in the investigation. All of those years, which she could have been using to act as her father's advocate, were now gone. She has spent the past decade trying to make up for lost time. She has joined up with several victim advocacy groups, such as Project Cold Case, based out of Florida. She penned a segment for a book the group published not too long ago called Grief Diaries, where she writes about her father's case and the issues that arose after his death. Tammy is also hoping to raise awareness for her father's case, in the hopes that it may someday be solved. She has remained active online, posting facts from her father's case in almost every comment or message board available, and has spread the suspect's sketch as far as she can. I was able to speak to Tammy while making this episode, and one thing is certain, she loves to talk. In our first phone conversation, which lasted about an hour, I believe I spoke for all of 2 or 3 minutes. She led me through the entire case of her father. The facts, theories, rumors, allegations, all of it, in a whirlwind of emotion. I truly do feel for her, and the rest of her family, who believe that Jack's case was pushed off to the side and quickly forgotten. For their credit, the Richland County Sheriff's Department have admitted their part in the sidetracked investigation. They openly admit that there was very little evidence to go off of, and because Jack Robinson was living such a private life at the time of his death, that there's not much else they could do. Without any physical evidence or additional eyewitnesses to go on, there's no way to track down the suspect. Tammy has many thoughts about this suspect, and who he may be. I won't even try to paraphrase her, so I'll just let her do the talking.
When he was murdered, there in off Rosewood Drive, it's near Olympia, which is where my father was born and raised. And pretty much I lived in Olympia and went to school there and everything too until my parents divorced and we moved away. They have a lot of fruit markets. They're big markets, where a bunch of fruits and vegetables come. Well, every Saturday we would always go get our fruits and vegetables, my grandmother, my mother, and I. And they had I don't know if they would be Cubans but there were people that would, that wouldn't be getting paid a lot of money, and they would empty out all of, put all the fruits and vegetables up for them, illegals, I guess you'd say. And they would house them right there on Rosewood Drive. They had an area, and at all different of the markets, they would house, and they would bring the people in. So he told me this last time, he said, Tammy, he said, I don't know if anyone has ever said anything to you, he said, but we really feel like that it's possible. He said, I'm going to say probably 97% that he wasn't illegal, that he was somebody that was around there at the time. We don't know, of course, who, but we really feel because of the description and from what they told the witnesses. And he said, and now that all the illegals are going to be sent back home, he said, we're afraid that that's what's going to happen. And he said, so we need to really move on it. Well, guess what? Do you think they've moved on it? They haven't done nothing. Still, they haven't moved on it. It still sinks in me, and there's days where I just sit and I'm thinking, how am I ever going to do this? And sometimes I have to pull myself away from it because otherwise it can just take you over. And I have to realize, that I do have a life, but at the same time, I cannot let go of this, and I won't let go of it. And, and I keep notes. I have notes on everything because, like I told my sons, if I die and his case is not solved, somebody, we're his boys. We have to talk for him. And nobody else is. The sheriff's office isn't, so I've got to talk for him. I have to put out his story. And otherwise, how in the hell is it going to get solved?
I must unfortunately close out this episode by telling you that, as of this moment, the 1996 murder of 65-year-old Jack L. Robinson remains unresolved. Thank you for listening to Unresolved. I cannot thank Jack Robinson's daughter, Tammy, enough. Without her help, I would not have even heard of Jack's story. We originally got in touch through Twitter, and without her publicizing the details of her father's case, this episode would not be possible. You can learn more about the case at the Facebook page Tammy has set up, simply named after her father, Jack L. Robinson. I'll post a link on social media for anyone interested. But thank you, Tammy, as well as everyone who listens to and supports this podcast. As I've said before, you can support the podcast by leaving Unresolved a 5-star rating and a positive review on iTunes, or Apple Podcasts, whatever it's referred to these days. You can also head to patreon.com/unresolvedpod to become a patron of the podcast, and gain access to some pretty cool perks. If you want to stay in touch with me or the podcast, you could do so in a variety of ways. There's always Facebook and Twitter, which I consider the quickest ways to reach me, and either can be found at Unresolved Pod. There's also a Facebook discussion group where I post some off-the-wall stuff and have some personal discussions about the podcast and true crime podcast in general. You can send in your emails to the unresolvedpodcast@gmail.com or unresolvedpod@gmail.com. Or you could even send them in to me personally at michael@unresolved.me. Once again, that's Michael with the E before the A, which I always blame my family for confusing or getting wrong or whatever. You can also send in text or leave your voicemails at 831-200-3550. That's 831-200-3550. I won't bore you with any more details, but I'm really looking forward to the rest of the year. I'm continuing to find people to help make the podcast more of a collaborative effort, and I hope to tell you all more about that in the very near future. But until then, everyone, stay safe, and I'll talk to you later.